Welcome to the Finely Tuned Infrastructure podcast by Rhythmic Technologies. So imagine finding out your free daily parking space suddenly costs $6 a day.
Oh man, yeah, that would be an immediate shock to the system.
Right, and then months later, the landlord quietly just says, hey, never mind, how do you even plan your commute after that?
You start looking very, very closely at the fine print of your lease agreement. I mean, when the rules of the road change that abruptly, it forces a complete rethink of your daily routine. You just
Okay.
can't operate on assumptions anymore.
Exactly. And that exact scenario actually played out recently in the cloud computing world. Today's conversation is based entirely on Rhythmic's blog posts detailing the AWS Cognito machine-to-machine, or M2M, pricing update.
Yeah, it was quite a saga.
It really was. We're exploring what originally happened with this billing change, what AWS eventually reversed, and most importantly, how you should architect your infrastructure now that the dust has finally settled.
It's a fascinating case study, honestly, because it isn't just about a line item on a bill. It's really a story about architectural decisions, the consequences of those decisions, and how cloud provider pricing fundamentally dictates how we build systems.
Yeah, the ripple effects are huge.
Exactly. And to grasp the impact of this, we really have to look at what Cognito M2M actually is under the hood. So Rhythmic's blog post describes it as the OAuth 2.0 client credentials flow.
Okay, so what does that actually mean in practice?
Basically, it's the mechanism that lets back-end services authenticate with each other without a human in the loop.
Got it. So Service A needs to prove to Service B that it's actually allowed to request data. How did this work mechanically before the pricing change even happened?
Well, in a distributed architecture, you definitely don't want services just trusting any random request that comes over the network. So you set up an app client incognito for each individual service.
Like giving each service its own ID badge.
Exactly like that. When Service A wants to talk to Service B, it first talks to Cognito, says, hey, here are my hard-coded credentials, and Cognito hands back a temporary token.
Okay. Making sense so far.
Then Service A passes that token to Service B along with its request. And for a long, long time, using Cognito for this specific machine-to-machine flow was entirely free. You just set it up and went about your day.
But then came the May 2024 announcement.
Yeah, that changed everything.
AWS introduced two brand new cost dimensions for Cognito M2M. First, a $6 per month fee per app client,
Right.
meaning every single service that authenticates gets its own app client, and you build that $6 monthly regardless of whether you even use it.
Yeah, just for having it exist.
And second, they added a fee of a fraction of a cent, specifically $0.00225 per 1,000 token requests. So every time a service authenticates and gets a token, the meter is running.
And, while that fraction of a penny for the tokens might seem incredibly small, the per-client fee was the absolute killer.
How bad was it?
Well, the blog post lays out a very grounded example to illustrate the math. Picture a modest microservices architecture. Just 19 services total.
19. That's not massive by today's standards.
Not at all. But under this new pricing model, that exact setup meant a baseline cost of $114 a month before a single token was ever issued.
Just for existing.
Exactly, just for turning it on.
And once you add in the actual token requests, that same modest setup easily landed at $200 to $400 a month for a configuration that cost absolutely $0 just 6 months prior.
Yeah, and it gets much, much worse if you scale up. The blog notes that for teams running distributed architectures with dozens of services, the math got uncomfortable fast.
Oh, I bet.
I mean, AWS's own example showed how certain configurations could add $2,500 a month to a bill.
$2,500. That's just wild. Why would a cloud provider introduce a pricing model that seemingly penalizes the exact distributed microservice architectures they've been telling us to build for years?
That is the core tension right there. That's what sparked a massive, sustained community reaction. I mean, for years, the industry best practice, heavily promoted by AWS themselves, has been to decouple systems, break down monoliths, and build microservices.
Right, that's the whole cloud-native playbook.
Exactly. But when you follow that playbook, you naturally increase the number of independent services that need to talk to each other securely. So by introducing a flat $6 fee per service, it felt like a retroactive tax on past architectural decisions.
Yeah, like you did what they asked, you built the distributed system, and suddenly you're handed a hefty monthly bill just for having those services registered in the system.
You're kind of stuck paying that bill. It completely explains why the invoices landing in June 2025 caused such an uproar.
Hmm.
Teams were looking at bills that had spiked dramatically for doing exactly what they'd always done.
But then, after hearing all that feedback from the community, AWS made a significant adjustment. It's like everyone was complaining about a massive $100 cover charge at a nightclub, so the club just dropped the cover entirely and now just charges you fractions of a penny per drink.
That's a perfect way to put it. In November 2025, AWS quietly removed the per-app client pricing dimension entirely.
Wow, just gone.
Just gone. No more $6 a month per service, no minimum charge just for having app clients registered. The only M2M cost that remains is that per token request fee.
So just the $0.0000225 per 1,000 successful token requests.
Exactly.
Okay, let's run the math on the new reality then. Looking back at that 19-service architecture example from the blog, if each of those 19 services authenticates 100 times per day, the monthly token request cost is now roughly 13 cents.
Yeah, 13 cents, not a typo. The cost that was previously $114 a month in client fees alone is effectively zero. The pricing model is finally aligned with actual usage rather than taxing you for merely having a distributed architecture.
So since it's just 13 cents now, should teams just completely ignore this cost moving forward?
Well, to answer that, we really have to look at what happened during the gap between the May announcement and the November reversal, because there was a grace period before the bills actually started landing.
And people didn't just sit around.
No, many engineering teams didn't wait. They took action and used that grace period to migrate off Cognito M2M entirely.
Right, they fled the nightclub before the cover charge was dropped.
Exactly. And Rhythmic's blog post outlines a few paths people took. Some re-architected to reduce their total service count, literally combining microservices back together just to avoid those $6 fees.
Undoing their decoupling.
Yeah, essentially going backwards architecturally. Others set up self-hosted alternatives like Keycloak, and many switched to IAM roles with SIG-v4 signing for their internal service authentication.
Okay, wait, let me push back on something here. If I spent months moving my team to a self-hosted solution like Keycloak, aren't I experiencing the sunk cost fallacy if I immediately reverse course just because AWS changed their mind?
It's a fair question, but you have to run the math objectively, specifically looking at the human and operational costs of self-hosting.
What do you mean by human costs?
Think about the Friday night pager duty when your self-hosted Keycloak instance goes down, or the ongoing burden of patching the underlying servers, maintaining the database it relies on, managing the instance costs, and just the general mental bandwidth required to run your own identity provider.
Oh, right.
Is avoiding a 13-cent AWS bill worth waking up your senior engineer at 2 a.m.?
Yeah, when you frame it like that, 13 cents a month is incredibly hard to beat. The ongoing maintenance of the new system vastly outweighs fractions of a penny.
Completely. And the blog explicitly warns not to assume your original decision to leave Cognito is permanent. Coming back is a legitimate option.
But what about the folks who move to IMM roles with SIG-v4 signing?
That's a slightly different story. For services running entirely within your AWS environment, meaning things living on EC2 instances, ECS containers, or Lambda functions, IAM roles with SIG-v4 signing are the native right architectural pattern, honestly, regardless of what Cognito costs.
Let's break down the mechanics of that. What exactly is SIG-v4 signing, and how does it differ from the auth tokens we were just talking about?
So instead of passing a bearer token back and forth like a hall pass, which is what Cognito M2M does, SIG-v4 actually uses cryptographic signing for every individual request.
Okay, a signature instead of token.
Right. When your EC2 instance or Lambda function needs to make an API call, it uses its assigned AWS IMM role credentials to calculate a cryptographic signature. And that signature is based on the specific contents of that exact request.
Oh, so it's unique to that one payload.
Exactly. It attaches that signature to the request header. Then the receiving AWS service recalculates the signature on its end to verify the sender's identity and ensure the request hasn't been tampered with in transit.
Wow, okay. So what makes that the superior pattern for internal services?
Well, when you use service identity through IAM, you get CloudTrail logging of every single API call out of the box. You get to enforce least privilege access through IAM policies.
Which means what, practically speaking?
It means you can restrict a service to only calling a very specific API endpoint rather than just giving it a broad token that can do who knows what. And crucially, there are zero per request authentication costs for this. It's really the AWS first approach for internal communication.
Got it. But what about the user-facing side? Rhythmic points out that the per-client pricing change never touched user pool monthly active user, or MAU, pricing.
Yeah, Cognito for user authentication remains very strong. The blog notes that Rhythmic recommends a hybrid approach for most architectures.
A hybrid approach.
Yeah, you use IAM and Zigbee4 for your internal machine-to-machine communication, and you use Cognito for your external user-facing flows where actual humans are logging in.
That makes a lot of sense.
It's an incredibly sound architecture, and the user auth side of the equation hasn't changed at all through this entire saga.
Okay, getting back to the teams staying on Cognito M2M, for whatever reason, the blog highlights a massive pitfall they need to watch out for. Even at fractions of a penny per 1,000 tokens, things can spiral if you have what they call bad caching.
Yeah, bad caching is dangerous. The per token cost is still very real, and it can compound rapidly at scale. The key mechanism here is the token validity window.
How long is that window?
Cognito M2M tokens are valid for 1 hour by default.
Okay, so not caching is like buying a brand new bus pass every time you transfer instead of just pulling out the 1-hour transfer pass you already bought.
That is exactly what it's like. If your services aren't caching those tokens and reusing them across API calls within that 1-hour window, you're generating token requests and paying for them that you fundamentally don't need.
You're just buying a new bus pass every single time you step onto a vehicle.
Right. And where does this become a critical issue? It's particularly dangerous in Lambda-heavy architectures.
Why Lambda specifically?
Well, with AWS Lambda, functions spin up fresh on every invocation. This is known as a cold start. Mechanically, when a request hits a Lambda function that isn't currently running, AWS has to provision a container, load your code, and initialize your runtime.
Okay, so it's starting completely from scratch.
Yes. And if you don't explicitly implement a caching layer outside of that immediate ephemeral execution context, your code realizes it needs to authenticate, so it asks Cognito for a brand new token.
Oh, wow. Which means your costs aren't tied to how much business you're doing. They're tied to how often your infrastructure is spinning up and shutting down. Every single cold start triggers a brand new token request.
Precisely. The blog emphasizes that at Rhythmic, implementing token caching is a core part of how they deploy Cognito M2M in client environments. A reasonable caching implementation brings most architectures' token request costs down to a negligible amount.
Because you're actually utilizing that 1-hour window.
Exactly. It's the difference between an authentication cost that scales smoothly with your business activity versus one that wildly scales with infrastructure churn.
It really highlights how a tiny architectural detail, just storing a token for an hour, can dictate the financial viability of a cloud service. So, stepping back for a second, what is the overarching philosophical takeaway from this entire timeline?
I think the biggest lesson is that cloud provider pricing is a legitimate input to architecture decisions, and it can and will change.
Right.
AWS walked back the per-client fee, yes, but they didn't change the underlying dynamic of the cloud supply chain. You're building on rented land, and the landlord can change the terms whenever they want.
So how do you protect yourself against that?
The engineering teams that were most resilient to this pricing change, whether they stayed on Cognito, migrated away, or migrated back, were the ones running infrastructure as code, specifically tools like Terraform.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, Rhythmic's blog post mentions they operate this way, boasting 214 open-source Terraform modules on GitHub. They use this to build auth infrastructure because it keeps you in control.
Let's talk about how Terraform actually manages that state. What's the mechanical difference between using Terraform and just clicking around the AWS console?
Well, when you click around the AWS console to set up an app client, that action is essentially undocumented and forgotten the moment you close your browser. 5 years later, nobody knows why that client exists or what it's attached to.
Right, it's just a mystery box.
Exactly. Terraform, on the other hand, uses declarative configuration files. You write code that says, hey, I need these 3 specific app clients. Terraform then creates a state file, which is a literal mapping of your code to the real-world resources in AWS.
So you have a documented, version-controlled source of truth. You can see exactly what app clients exist, what they're doing, and what they cost. You can migrate, consolidate, or roll back without having to perform what the blog calls archaeology to figure out what's actually running.
That's the beauty of it. The teams that scrambled and panicked in May 2025, they couldn't answer basic questions like, how many app clients do we have? Which ones are actively used? Which services are actually caching tokens? If you can't answer those questions quickly, you don't really know what is running in your environment.
That is a harsh reality. If it took a team days to figure out how many app clients they even had, the AWS pricing change wasn't their actual problem. It was just the flashlight that exposed their lack of visibility.
Absolutely.
For teams listening right now who want to get that visibility, how does the blog recommend monitoring these costs going forward?
There are two main strategies they suggest. First, for high-level cost tracking, you can go into AWS Cost Explorer, filter by the Amazon Cognito service, and then filter by usage type to isolate the specific M2M token request costs.
Okay, that's good for the high-level view. But what if you need more granular data, like
Right.
figuring out which specific service is the one buying a new bus pass every time?
For that, you need to dig into the logs. You can send CloudTrail events to CloudWatch logs. And from there, you query for token post events specifically tied to a client credentials grant.
Token pass. Got it.
Yeah. This gives you exact request counts broken down by app client. If you're running a multi-tenant or multi-service architecture, this is how you allocate costs to specific services and clearly identify which ones are failing to cache tokens properly.
That makes total sense. So, to summarize where things stand today, if you're still on Cognito M2M, you need to implement token caching immediately if you haven't already. Audit your app clients, remove the unused ones, and rest easy knowing the per token cost is negligible.
Yep. And if you migrated off Cognito M2M, sit down and run the math on your current solution's operational cost against the new per token pricing. Revisit whether your self-hosted trade-off still makes financial and operational sense.
And what if someone is just starting out?
Well, if you're evaluating Cognito M2M for a brand new system, the per token pricing shouldn't be a deal breaker unless you have massive volume and just completely refuse to cache. The real question is whether you need an auth flow at all, or if native IAM roles are the cleaner fit for your internal environment.
Ultimately, AWS made a pricing decision that didn't work. They heard the loud feedback from the community and they reversed it. As the blog states, that is worth acknowledging.
It definitely is.
But it's equally worth remembering that it happened once and it could happen again in either direction. The only true defense is building infrastructure that lets you respond to changes without a crisis. Know exactly what you're running and keep it all in code. It forces us to look in the mirror at our own setups. What other hidden architectural debts in your system are just one cloud provider pricing update away from becoming a major crisis? This conversation was generated from Rhythmic's blog post. To read the original piece and explore their author architecture recommendations, visit rhythmictech.com.